Now, Arthur Porter has asked me about revisionism. So let's talk about revisionism, right? That's become just a nasty word in the Marxist movement. If I don't agree with you, I maintain that I'm a real Marxist and you're a revisionist. You're revising Marxism, but I believe in real Marxism. You're a revisionist. And that's what it's come to be known as, right? If I think you're a sellout and a phony, I call you a revisionist. And if you think I'm a sellout and a phony, you call me a revisionist. That's not what the term actually originated as. The term revisionist was invented by Eduard Bernstein. And Eduard Bernstein called himself a revisionist. He thought it was a good thing to be a revisionist. Eduard Bernstein was a political figure in the Second International. After Marx had died, you had, the continuing Marxist movement in Europe centered around the German Social Democratic Party. You had the Second International. This fellow by the name of Eduard Bernstein, who actually had some direct connections to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, like I think he was related or something. He was not a small figure. This wasn't some obscure figure. This was somebody who really was prominent among the Marxist movement. Eduard Bernstein. He came out with his new theory of Marxism that he called revisionist Marxism, or revisionism. And basically, his theory centered around the slogan, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And basically, he disagreed with Marx about the need for a revolution. He argued that no, capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism, one step at a time. He argued that there was no event horizon, there was no revolution that took place. This notion that one day you have a revolution and you go from capitalism to socialism, he didn't agree with that. His notion was that socialism is merely the sum of reforms. And he argued that the fact that, and this is hilarious, I think, that universal male suffrage existed. No one was even talking about letting women vote. But the fact that in Germany, Austria, France, other countries, they let every man vote, whether he owned property or not, proved that you didn't have to have a revolution. Because eventually the working class would outvote the capitalist class because there was more of them. Universal male suffrage was the first step towards socialism in Europe, he argued, right? Next, they had some places, like in Britain and other places, where they passed a 12-hour workday. They couldn't make you work more than 12 hours, right? Wow. And that was Eduard Bernstein. Eduard Bernstein he said there was no contradiction between reform and revolution, that reform and revolution are synonymous, and that the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, and that socialism is merely what he said, the, quote, sum of reforms. That's Eduard Bernstein. And he said he was a revisionist. And it was based on the fact that revolutions were not happening in Europe. The Marxist movement was huge. 1880s, 1890s, Marxism was expanding all over Europe, but there wasn't a revolution. So why was that? Well, Eduard Bernstein said, well, it's because the revolution is merely the sum of reforms. And we're not going to have a revolution. We're just going to kind of gradually move towards socialism. Look, we got universal male suffrage. Next, we're going to have, 12-hour work days. Next thing you know, we're going to have labor unions recognized in factories. Pretty soon, we're going to have socialism. So that's Bernstein. And that's basically social democracy. The forces that call themselves social democrats, they want to build socialism one step at a time, and they don't think there's a clear dividing line. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing, socialism is the sum of reforms. That was the revisionist current. And Karl Kautsky was the main opponent of revisionism. Karl Kautsky was the leader of German social democracy, and he maintained, oh, no, revolution has to happen, this is not correct. And that was interesting. The Marxist movement, the Second International, technically opposed revisionism on paper. And Karl Kautsky was famous for his arguments against Bernstein. Bernstein folks broke away and formed the revisionist movement, and they were not part of the Second International. They were not the mainstream current of Marxism. Karl Kautsky and Eduard Bernstein didn't like each other. Fascinating. Fascinating history there. However, I will add that there was another component to Eduard Bernstein and revisionism that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is that Eduard Bernstein was what you could call a social imperialist, whereas he believed not only was capitalism in the West gradually transforming into socialism one step at a time, but that colonialism was good because it was bringing capitalism that was more advanced than what existed in the third world to the third world. So that colonialism was good. That's a big part of Bernsteinism that people don't recognize, right? Social imperialism, right? That, hey, the British are going to go take over India. That's great because they're going to make India capitalist, and then eventually India will become socialist. That's great, right? The British are going to Africa and slaughtering whole villages. Well, we don't believe in slaughtering whole villages, but again, they're going to make Africa capitalist. Eventually Africa will become socialist, social imperialism. And that was a big part of the revisionist current as well. Social imperialism, right? So that's the essence of revisionism, right? Now, the term, Lenin was obviously very opposed to Eduard Bernstein. Lenin eventually was very opposed to Karl Kautsky. But the talk of revisionism didn't really get revived, I guess, until the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and China had their falling out in 1961, the Sino-Soviet Split. The Sino-Soviet Split of 1961 was when the term revisionism got more broadly used among Marxists and leftists. And that was because Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union, and he was trying to have peace with the West. And he basically told people all throughout the developing world that they should not have revolutions because it was too dangerous, because the United States had the atomic bomb. USA has the atomic bomb, so people in South Africa, people in Latin America, people in Asia don't have a revolution. It's too scary. The USA has the atomic bomb. Put the world revolution on hold. USA has the atomic bomb. Stop it. That was his argument. So China, under the leadership of Mao, eventually cut ties with the Soviet Union. And they accused the Soviet Union of being revisionist. That was what they pulled that out of the history of Marxism. They said the Soviet leaders are revisionists, right? And there's a manifesto. Long Live Leninism was one of the documents the Chinese Communist Party published to criticize Khrushchev. There's another document, on Khrushchev's phony communism and its lessons for the world. There's a number of manifestos the Chinese Communist Party published to criticize Khrushchev and the Soviet leaders. They called them revisionists. However, and this is where it gets interesting, from 1961, from the first days of the Sino-Soviet split, up until about 1969, China never said the Soviet Union was capitalist. It said that it was revisionist. Like, that was the difference, right? 1961, China and the Soviet Union cut ties. 1966, you have the Cultural Revolution in China, which is basically Mao accusing the Chinese Communist Party of being revisionist and building a mass movement of young people to overthrow the leaders of the Communist Party. And that happened in 1966. Students all across China, the Red Guards, overthrew the Communist Party leadership. Then in 1969, the end of the 1960s, they called a new Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And it was an entirely new party. They'd thrown out all the people that were opposed to Mao and the Cultural Revolution. It was a totally new party. And at the 1969 Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, interestingly, Mao at that point was so old, right? Mao is the leader of the revolution. He just kind of walks out. Very famous video clip. You've probably seen it if you watch any documentary about Chinese history. Mao, who's very old man, very large, he just kind of walks out and waves at everybody, and everyone in the audience is sobbing and crying because Mao is the leader of the Chinese Revolution, and they're all waving their red books, and they're just sobbing and crying, and it's this huge auditorium of people, and Mao walks out and waves at everybody, and everyone's waving their red books and crying, and it's this hugely emotional moment. And that's what Mao did at the Chinese Communist Party's 1969 Congress. Mao didn't really do that much because he was really, really old. But the guy who gave the big speech, the main report to the Chinese Communist Party's 1969 Congress, the guy who did that was Lin Biao, who was a general who had fought alongside Mao, who was the man who was behind the Cultural Revolution mainly. And Lin Biao, he gave a speech at the 1969 Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, and that speech was published as a book that China sent all over the world. And that book is called Long Live the Victory of People's War. Long Live the Victory of People's War. And that book also doesn't say the Soviet Union was capitalist. It says the Soviet Union was revisionist. right? It talks about Mao's military theory of how you organize in the countryside and seize the cities, guerrilla warfare, Che Guevara kind of stuff. And then it goes from there to argue that the global communist revolution will be based on Mao's military strategy for the Chinese revolution. That the third world is like the countryside of the world, and eventually the third world will have communist revolution, and then the third world will seize the first world. That's basically what it argues. That there's no point in really having a revolution in the United States or in Western Europe because they're too capitalist, but the third world will have its revolution first, and then eventually the first world will be seized, right? It's third worldism, basically, right? But, in the third world, being a third worldist isn't a thing. But it was, Lin Biao's Long Live the Victory of People's War. And then the last chapter of Long Live the Victory of People's War by Lin Biao, the final part of his presentation to the 1969 Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, the final part of his presentation is called "The Soviet Revisionists Are Betrayers of People's War." You read it, he says the Soviet Union are traitors to the people around the world that are fighting for, revolution and all that. The Soviet Union sold them out, it's not supporting them, it's not good. Doesn't say they're an empire, doesn't say they're capitalist. It wasn't until the fall of Lin Biao mysteriously disappears. They said he died in he was trying to overthrow Mao, and then he got on a plane and tried to go to the Soviet Union or something. He died with the Gang of Four that came into power after the fall of Lin Biao, Mao's wife and 3 other people, the Gang of Four. They declared the Soviet Union, they stopped calling the Soviet Union revisionist, and they started calling the Soviet Union social imperialists, state capitalists, social imperialists, social fascists. That is the difference. Revisionist is a term for a Marxist who is no longer believing in revolution. Social imperialist means you're not a Marxist at all. You're an imperialist. Big difference, right? Keep in mind, Fidel Castro also said the Soviet leaders were revisionists. Keep in mind, Che Guevara also said the Soviet leaders were revisionists. Kim Il-sung also said the Soviet leaders were revisionists. There was widespread belief that the Soviet leaders were revisionists. But there was not, when China declared the Soviet Union was an imperialist country, it was a capitalist country, that was a completely different change. That was not the same thing at all. And that's important, right? And I think that needs to be raised. So I hope that answers your question. When someone says revisionist, it's just become a slur. It means I don't agree with you. But what it actually meant, originally it was this current among social democrats, and then it became a slur during the Cold War, and that's what the term revisionism means. And it's very interesting, because again, everyone you don't like is a revisionist, right? And there you go. And to some degree, this notion that Marxism is like the Bible, right? You only believe the true holy word of Marx, right? Well, Lenin disagreed with Karl Marx on many points. Lenin supported nationalism. Marx said that all nationalism was reactionary. Marx believed that the revolutions would happen first in the Western countries and then expand to the third world. Lenin said, flip, it's going to happen in the third world first, it'll go to the first world, right? Marx did not understand, capitalism in Marx's time evolved to the system of imperialism or capitalism in its monopoly stage, the rule of finance capital. In Marx's times, industrial capitalists ruled. In the time of Lenin, it was bankers that ruled. So Lenin was a revisionist, I guess, right? He revised Marxism. That's not the whole thing, right? That Marxism is a science, right? That you don't, Marxism is not religion. It's not like, well, in the holy writing of Marx, it says, so therefore, there used to be a bumper sticker. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. I remember that from my little town in Ohio. There was a bumper sticker. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Well, that's not how you're supposed to think if you're a Marxist. All right? If you want to be an evangelical Christian, that's a great bumper sticker for you to have. But if you say, Marx said it, I believe it, and that settles it, that means you support the British colonizing India. That means that you support the USA taking over Texas from Mexico. That means you don't believe you believe all nationalism is inherent. No, come on now. Come on. Dogmatism, says JT24, and he's right. That's what that is, right? If your attitude is Marx said it, I believe it, that settles it. Just like an evangelical, let me back that up. All right, evangelical Christians, as Bill Maher and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins are key to point out, they don't really believe that, right? Because the Bible also says don't eat shellfish. The Bible also says that disrespectful children should be stoned to death. So no Christian who says, God says it, I believe it, and that settles it, I follow the Bible. No, they don't, right? And no Marxist who goes around saying, I am a pure Marxist, I do not revise Marxism at all, they don't. They don't. Right, they don't. So, dogma is not a good thing. In religion, in politics, in ideology, dogma is not a good thing. So, there's a movie that came out called La Chinoise. It was by a French filmmaker, Jean-Luc Godard. And it's about a group of French students who are Maoists. And they are having fights among each other. And that when they don't like somebody, they go, Revisionist, Revisionist. And they're all waving their red books and chanting, you're a revisionist, Revisionist, Revisionist. It's, Oh, boy.